How you guys doing today? Today I'm going to be making a video talking about The Last of Us. Now, this is a game that came out back in 2014. Well, not 2014, 2013. It was released back in 2014 for the PlayStation 4. Um, so today I'm going to talk about this is going to be kind of a rant video detailing what I don't like about this game and why I think this game is hugely overrated. Um, and I've talked about this with my buddy. I've talked about this. I just thought about this, randomly, just random thoughts coming up, and um, I got a lot of things to say in this video. So, beginning off, my first point is The Last of Us. I don't think that's a really good game. From a gameplay standpoint, I don't think it's a very good game. Um, from a gameplay standpoint, it plays like a worse version of the Uncharted games, and that's not really saying much because the Uncharted games are pretty subpar by gameplay standards, especially taking into consideration third-person shooting. Vanquish and Gears of War do a way better job than Uncharted can ever do. If we're talking about third-person shooters, comparing Gears and comparing Vanquish, those games do a much better job with third-person gameplay mechanics as opposed to The Last of Us and Uncharted. Especially Uncharted. Uncharted is just a mediocre at best third-person shooter. Now, with that being said, I'm going to get into some of my issues with The Last of Us as a game. I'm not going to be having any gameplay, so you're just going to have to see my face. I'm going to show a couple of games as well as to what I think is the better alternative to The Last of Us. So The Last of Us primarily is whenever we hear about this game. By the way, I seen The Last of Us 2 reveal. It was very underwhelming. That's the same bullshit from the first game. It didn't change anything. It's the same mediocre gameplay from the first game. So, but what is there to get excited about with that? But I'm just gonna. Well, before I get into my issues, I'm gonna talk about how much time I've spent with the game. I've beaten the game about like 4 times. Across the the PS3. I think I've maybe beaten it about 3 times. I don't remember. I think maybe 3 times. Maybe a little bit more. Maybe 3 times because I was trying to. It's not like I enjoyed the game. The reason why I ended up beating the game so many times was because I wanted to go for the trophies. The trophies were really the thing I was going for, especially after my first playthrough. So with that being said, that shows you how much enjoyment I've had with the game. Where I just basically went for the trophies that reward you for beating New Game Plus and the normal difficulty modes. I just thought it was really easy. Went for it. Wanted to boost up my trophy level and percentage, I guess, in this case. But yeah, so I've played a good deal of the game to talk about it, basically. All right. So, and I'm going to show you some alternative games that are much better at what they do than The Last of Us was praised for. Now, The Last of Us is a game that's primarily praised for the story, right? To me, I thought the story was pretty average at best. It's a pretty amateur story. The average Hollywood movie, even low budget fucking Hollywood movie can do this. What the story did with very little effort. I think the thing that The Last of Us tricks people with is it tricks people with what it shows you to be a good story. It shows you a good story, but it's not a good story by proxy. Because the game doesn't really have a good story. It's a very amateur and average story at best. Not very creative at all. The thing that this game does is it has presentation. Presentation and cutscenes. Presentation and cutscenes equal great story by modern gamers standards today. That is what many people nowadays, especially, rectify as a great story. Okay, that is the standard that the modern gaming audience has now. All right, so you're not seeing a good story. You're not hearing a good story. You're seeing a story that is tricking you into thinking it's a good story by presentation and cutscenes. Because on paper, if you were to read The Last of Us story, that shit wouldn't even be a bestseller. It's a boring story. It's average at best. As a matter of fact, this game right here that The Last of Us copied off of, Enslaved Odyssey to the West, has a much better and much more creative story. Actually. And this game is by Ninja Theory. It's actually one of the hidden gems of the last generation. I played this game. My buddy, he platinumed this game and everything. He actually told me about this game, Enslaved. And I remember when this game came out, and people were saying this is like an Uncharted clone. I'm like, no, it's not no Uncharted clone. This game was way better than Uncharted. It had way more of a creative game setting, way more of a creative story, and The Last of Us copied off of this game. Guys, The Last of Us copied off of this game. Enslaved. Let me show it a little bit closer to my camera. Enslaved. Yeah, The Last of Us copied this. If you look at the settings, you look at the story, and even the post-apocalyptic, of course the post-apocalyptic elements are different, but you can tell that Naughty Dog actually copied this fucking game. They very much so copied this game. They're not similar. No, they copied this. And then they threw in some elements from Uncharted. And, they also threw in some elements from what was trending at the time, like post-apocalyptic modern zombie movies, like The Walking Dead and stuff like Zombieland. Shit like that was really trending at the time. Even though the game came out in 2013, but even so, it was still pretty much a big thing. So, basically, yeah, The Last of Us copied this. Okay? Naughty Dog, the Naughty Dog you have now is not the Naughty Dog you had back in the 90s and early 2000s that made Jack and Crash. Okay, the Naughty Dog you have now they are copycats. Alright? They are copycats that don't have a creative bone in their body. You remember when Uncharted 4 was coming out and they had there was a little controversy with Naughty Dog stealing concept art from Assassin's Creed 4 and showing it in one of their trailers? That's just one example of Naughty Dog getting caught stealing. But they're always stealing. From that Enslaved game that I just showed you, they stole from that. That's where they got the story. That's where they got the setting. That's where they got the inspiration to make the fucking game. They basically stole the whole thing from Enslaved. A little known game. And you can't say Enslaved stole from them because Enslaved came out 2 years earlier. It came out in 2011. So Last of Us was in its development process, so they stole from the fucking game. That's what they did. Even the story, when you're playing as Monkey and then I forgot the other girl's name, but the other girl's name, it's the same exact story. Two people who don't have very much in common, coming together to get to where they need to get to, their own promised lands, so to speak. Last of Us did the same shit. So yeah. So That's just one example. But anyway, going back to The Last of Us. Yeah, so The Last of Us story is often talked about as one of the best stories ever told in gaming. Again, like I said, they're giving you the illusion of having a great story. It's not a great story. It's subpar. It would be subpar by retro game standards. You understand? Modern game standards define video game stories and video games by graphics and presentation. That's about the gist of it. All right. So, okay, moving on from that. We're going to go more in depth on my issues with this game. People often, whenever they get asked, what is one of their favorite Naughty Dog games? Nowadays they would say Last of Us or the Uncharted series. Again, these games are defined by modern gaming standards, not retro gaming standards, which held games to a much higher decree. Nowadays, you can make anything as long as it looks good. It gives you the illusion that it plays good, and the presentation is good. You got a 10 out of 10 game, baby. There really needs to be no test. But yeah, so going back to the story is not even that interesting. It's not even interesting. Even as a video game, it's not even an interesting story. As a movie, it wouldn't be an interesting story. As a book, it wouldn't be a good, interesting story. I'm going to show you some games that I think do stories way better for video games. And I don't know, maybe in the comment section you can tell me what you think. But as far as lore is concerned, I'm going to show you a game that you probably wouldn't expect. And that's Dead Space. Yeah, Dead Space. The reason why I brought out Dead Space is because Dead Space is a survival horror game, or a third-person horror game, similar to Last of Us, right? So I wanted to bring this game out because it kind of has similar themes of horror and survival, right? And this game is a lot more unique, even though it takes a lot of inspiration from games like System Shock and Doom and, well, at least Doom 3. But, you know, games like System Shock and Doom and it takes inspiration from movies like Alien and Event Horizon, but it does it in a way that it uses the inspiration not necessarily to create an uncreative game. They created a very unique game with this game right here, with Dead Space. And of course, gameplay inspirations from Resident Evil 4. But they created a very unique game right here. Oh, well, not very unique, but at least a unique game enough to satiate my appetite for a video game. I thought this game was pretty good as far as a third-person horror shooter was concerned. You know what I'm saying? And the lore and the story behind the Necromorphs, even watching a lot of the other Dead Space movies, Aftermath, and I think, what was it, Dead Space Downfall, and just watching and reading the lore behind, and that's the thing that really defines, I think, a video game story as well, that people do not talk about, the lore. The lore really defines a video game story, much more than the actual presentation and cutscenes, because the real meat of the story is the lore. Excuse me, I was about to say that word. The real meat and potatoes of a game is its lore. The lore is what I think carries a video game story more than anything else. So, yeah, Dead Space has a much better story. Better lore, very much more unique and creative. And that's another thing that I'm going to get into in part 2 of this video is how uncreative Naughty Dog is. Naughty Dog is very uncreative because they're not the Naughty Dog we had in the 90s and early 2000s. They're just a generic AAA modern video game studio that makes playable games that are better than the average AAA release, but that's not saying much because most of those games are mediocre at best. But I'm going to make a part 2 to this video. So stay tuned for the part 2. I'm going to be uploading this part 1. And I hope you hate or enjoy this video. So part 2 is going to be coming right after part 1. Thank you.